The truck hasn't moved yet. It's sitting in a yard on the edge of Fairbanks, Alaska, engine idling in the dark. Frost already forming on the trailer sidewalls even though the thermometer hasn't dropped below -20 yet. The driver is walking around it, flashlight in hand, in a methodical loop that has nothing to do with checking a box on a form. He is checking whether he will survive the next 2 days. That is what preparation looks like on the Dalton Highway. Not excitement, not gear lists. A quiet, systematic reckoning with everything that can go wrong on 414 miles of mostly gravel road where the nearest hospital is in Fairbanks, the town he is about to leave. Or in Deadhorse, at the very end, where the road runs out at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. There is nothing in between except wilderness, pipeline, and cold. Most people who have heard of the Dalton Highway know it from television. They know it as the ice road, the haul road, the road where trucks slide off cliffs and get swallowed by blizzards. What that version of the story almost never shows is the hour before departure, the hour in the yard. Because that hour, that quiet, unglamorous procedural hour, is where experienced Dalton drivers say the real decisions get made. Everything that happens on the road is a consequence of everything that happened in that yard. This is the story of what it actually takes to prepare for the most dangerous highway in North America. Not the driving, not the storms. What happens before the wheels even start turning? If you're watching this on your television right now, and we know most of you are, we'd ask a small favor. If this kind of story is worth your time, consider sharing it with someone. Word of mouth and subscriptions are what keep this channel going. That's it. Now let's go back to Fairbanks. The Dalton Highway was built in 1974, constructed in just 5 months to support the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system during its construction, and it has been a working industrial corridor ever since. It runs 414 miles from Livingood, a small community about 80 miles north of Fairbanks, to Deadhorse on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, near the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. About 75% of the road is gravel. It crosses the Yukon River, the Arctic Circle, the Brooks Range, and the Continental Divide. It has 20 permanent bridges. It was built with 32 million cubic yards of gravel, and it carries, according to figures cited across multiple transportation sources, roughly 3,700 large commercial trucks every single month. More in winter than in summer. Because frozen ground makes certain routes viable that cannot be driven any other time of year. Those trucks are carrying the things that keep Prudhoe Bay functioning. Fuel for the generators and equipment, food for the workers, drilling materials, pipeline hardware, industrial machinery, replacement parts for systems that, if they fail at 70 below, become emergencies within hours. There is no other road in. There is no rail line. When the supply chain on the Dalton stops, the North Slope starts running out of things it cannot do without. That is the freight that experienced commercial drivers are carrying when they pull out of Fairbanks and head north. And that freight is part of what shapes how they prepare before they leave. Understanding the weight of what's on the trailer changes how you think about the hour in the yard. The preparation for a Dalton Highway winter run begins well before the driver even arrives at the terminal. It begins with something that most people outside the trucking industry don't realize exists as a formal professional category: route-specific experience. The Dalton Highway is not a road that carriers assign to new drivers. Companies like Carlisle Transportation, which has been running the haul road since 1985, make documented distinctions between general commercial driving experience and Dalton-specific experience. A driver with 20 years of over-the-road history in the lower 48 is not automatically qualified to run the haul road in winter. The road demands a different calibration, a different relationship between judgment and conditions that only comes from having made the run repeatedly in multiple seasons. Carlisle has described its approach to the Dalton as a developed methodology, not simply a driving assignment, and that methodology starts with who gets to make the run in the first place. This matters because the pre-trip preparation that a veteran haul road driver performs in Fairbanks is not the same as the standard commercial vehicle pre-trip inspection required by federal law. Federal regulations. Under the FMCSA framework that governs all commercial motor vehicle operations, require drivers to inspect specific components before each trip: brakes, lighting, tires, steering, horn, mirrors, coupling devices, wheels, and emergency equipment. That inspection is mandatory. But experienced Dalton drivers describe what they do in Fairbanks as something that extends well beyond the regulatory minimum. They describe it as a survival audit, and the difference between those two things is significant. The brake system, for example, receives a level of attention in a Dalton pre-trip that goes well beyond checking adjustment and looking for obvious wear. Brake lines on commercial trucks use compressed air, and compressed air systems are vulnerable to moisture. In normal commercial operations, small amounts of moisture in the airlines are a nuisance that the system's dryer manages adequately. On the Dalton in winter, small amounts of moisture in the airlines can freeze and cause brake failure at -40. Experienced drivers know this. They drain their air tanks completely before a Dalton run, purging any accumulated moisture. They check the air dryer cartridge, not just for function, but for the stage of its service cycle. Because a dryer cartridge that's approaching its replacement interval will handle moisture less effectively. And on the haul road in winter, less effective moisture management is the kind of subtle degradation that turns into a crisis. A driver who checks the brake system in Fairbanks and finds the dryer cartridge at 80% service life may be completely within federal compliance. An experienced haul road driver with that finding might change the cartridge before leaving anyway. Because on this particular road, 80% is not good enough. Tires are another category where the Dalton pre-trip extends well beyond standard practice. The road surface is primarily gravel, which is significantly harder on tires than asphalt. Not just in terms of puncture risk, which is real and well documented, but in terms of heat generation during extended operation at highway speeds. In summer, this is a primary concern. In winter, the concern shifts. Cold rubber is less pliable, less able to conform to irregular surfaces, and more likely to crack under sudden stress. Tire pressure drops with temperature, roughly 1 psi for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature decrease. And a tire that was properly inflated in Fairbanks at 15 degrees will be underinflated by the time the truck climbs into the -40 environment north of the Brooks Range. Experienced drivers account for this, setting tire pressure slightly higher than the nominal specification in Fairbanks so that the pressure settles into the correct range at operational temperature. This is not something the federal inspection checklist prompts a driver to do. It's knowledge that comes from experience with this specific road in this specific climate. Fuel systems require the most extensive pre-departure attention because diesel fuel behaves in ways on the Dalton that it does not behave anywhere else in the continental commercial trucking network. Standard ultra-low sulfur diesel begins to cloud, to develop wax crystal formation, at temperatures that vary by formulation, but are typically in the range of 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Below the cloud point, those wax crystals begin to clog fuel filters. Below the pour point, the temperature at which the fuel stops flowing as a liquid, the problem becomes catastrophic. A truck with a fuel system that isn't properly treated for extreme cold can stop moving not because of a mechanical failure, but because the fuel in its tanks has essentially gelled into a semi-solid. In Fairbanks, before a winter Dalton run, this is not a theoretical concern. It is the first thing fuel system preparation addresses. Commercial carriers operating on the haul road use a combination of approaches. Winter blended diesel, which Fairbanks fuel suppliers formulate with a lower cloud point for Alaska winter conditions. Fuel additives, which are alcohol-based compounds that lower the gel point and disperse wax crystals. And heated fuel systems, which use engine coolant or electrical resistance elements to keep the fuel at a temperature above gelling. None of these measures alone is considered sufficient by experienced haul road operators. The belt and suspenders approach, winter blend plus additive plus fuel system heat, is standard operating practice because the consequences of a fuel system failure north of the Brooks Range are severe. There is no roadside diesel delivery. There is no tow truck waiting around the corner. A gelled fuel system in the Brooks Range in winter, in darkness at -50, is not a mechanical inconvenience. It is a survival situation. The fuel check in Fairbanks also involves planning the actual fuel load for the run. The Dalton has 2 refueling points. Coldfoot Camp at mile 175, the northernmost truck stop in North America, operated year-round and founded by Iditarod champion Dick Mackey in 1981, and Dead Horse at the northern terminus. That means there are stretches where a driver may need to cover 239 miles without access to fuel, specifically the segment between Coldfoot and Dead Horse. Commercial trucks with standard fuel tanks of 150 to 300 gallons have sufficient range to cover this gap under normal conditions. But winter conditions are not normal conditions. Extended idling to keep the engine warm, reduced fuel efficiency from increased aerodynamic drag in headwinds, and the fuel consumed by the auxiliary systems all reduce effective range. An experienced Dalton driver calculates the fuel load conservatively, accounting for worst-case idle time and maximum headwind, and leaves Fairbanks with tanks as close to full as the weight limit allows. The weight consideration connects to another layer of pre-trip preparation that is specific to Alaska and to this road: the regulatory framework governing commercial vehicle weight limits. Alaska operates under a unique permitting system for oversized and overweight loads, and the Dalton Highway carries a significant percentage of exactly those loads. The industrial equipment and large-scale components that the Prudhoe Bay oil fields require. FMCSA regulations are enforced in Alaska as they are in every state, but Alaska's specific vehicle size and weight provisions reflect the reality of a freight network that must move things no other transportation mode can. Drivers carrying permitted oversized loads must have those permits in the cab, current and correctly specified, before leaving Fairbanks. An oversized load that departs Fairbanks with a permit error doesn't get discovered until the driver encounters an Alaska DOT or Alaska State Trooper enforcement point. And on the Dalton, the consequence of a compliance problem isn't just a fine or a delay. It may mean turning around with a full load on a road where turning around an 80-foot combination vehicle is not always straightforward. There is also the matter of cargo security. The Dalton Highway's surface, mostly gravel with permafrost heaves, washboarding, and sections that become severely rutted or iced, transmits vibration and shock to the cargo in ways that a smooth highway does not. Loads that are properly secured for lower 48 highway conditions may shift on the haul road. Heavy industrial equipment, pipe, structural steel, drilling components. These are not things that shift harmlessly. A load shift at highway speed on a gravel road with an icy surface, on a truck navigating a mountain pass, can change the vehicle's handling characteristics suddenly and severely. Experienced drivers do not rely on the standard tie-down calculations for the Dalton. They add securing points. They use additional dunnage. They check the load from multiple angles before departure, and in some cases have the cargo staged specifically for haul road transport, which involves different consideration for weight distribution over the axles than would apply on a paved highway. The sleeper cab preparation is another dimension that receives serious attention in Fairbanks. Unlike a typical over-the-road run where a driver can generally expect to find a truck stop with facilities within a reasonable distance, a Dalton winter run may require the driver to spend 1 or more nights stopped on the road in conditions where exiting the cab becomes dangerous. This has occurred many times. Blizzards close Adigun Pass with no warning available to drivers already north of Coldfoot, who then wait, sometimes for days, in their trucks. Avalanche closures at the pass have trapped trucks for extended periods. The sleeper cab for a Dalton run is provisioned accordingly. Food for more meals than the planned trip duration. Water in containers that won't freeze. Sleeping equipment rated for temperatures well below what the cab heating system maintains. And in many cases, the kind of redundant personal emergency equipment. Fire starter, emergency blankets, signaling devices that experienced haul road drivers carry without being asked to. The APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, receives particular scrutiny before a Dalton departure. This is the onboard generator that powers the sleeper cab's climate control system independently of the main engine, compliant with the MAPI 21 weight exemption that allows the additional 550 pounds of APU equipment. without counting against the truck's weight limit. On most runs, a well-maintained APU is a comfort system. On the Dalton in winter, it is a survival system. If the APU fails during a forced stop north of the Brooks Range at -50, the driver's options are to run the main engine continuously, consuming fuel at a rate that may exceed what's available, or to manage a seriously cold sleeping environment with layering and survival equipment alone. Neither is ideal. Experienced drivers have APU units from manufacturers like Thermo King or Carrier Transicold serviced specifically before a winter haul road season. They check fuel lines, heating elements, battery connections, and control systems with the same rigor they apply to the truck's main engine. An APU that performs adequately in the lower 48 in November may not perform the same way at Adigun Pass in January. Communications equipment is another pre-trip category that doesn't appear prominently in the standard federal inspection requirements, but dominates the preparation checklist for experienced haul road drivers. Cell phone coverage does not exist along most of the Dalton Highway. This is not a rural coverage inconvenience. It is a near total absence of cellular infrastructure for the overwhelming majority of the 414 miles. Drivers who rely on a smartphone for navigation, weather, or emergency communication on the Dalton will have none of those functions available for most of the run. CB radio is the primary communication medium on the haul road, and experienced commercial drivers on the corridor use it actively, warning each other about road conditions ahead, identifying one another's positions on blind curves, communicating the status of a closure or a stuck vehicle. Before a Dalton departure, a driver confirms that the CB is functional, that the antenna connection is secure, and that they know the channels in use among haul road traffic. Beyond CB, a growing number of experienced haul road drivers carry satellite communication devices. These are personal locator beacons or two-way satellite communicators that function independently of cellular infrastructure, allowing a driver to send a distress signal or communicate with dispatch from anywhere on the 414 miles, including the Brooks Range segments, where no other communication is possible. This is not yet a carrier requirement in every case, but it reflects the evolution of thinking about what preparation looks like on a road where a breakdown in the wrong location could otherwise mean an extended period of radio silence from an asset carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars of cargo. The weather check before a Dalton departure is an art form that goes beyond looking at a forecast. Alaska weather forecasting for interior and Arctic regions involves multiple specialized data sources. The National Weather Service offices in Fairbanks and Anchorage issue specific Dalton Highway corridor forecasts, and Alaska DOT and public facilities operate 7 year-round maintenance camps along the Dalton, each of which has personnel with ground truth knowledge of current conditions. Experienced drivers and dispatch offices contact those maintenance camps directly before departure. A forecast may say partly cloudy and -30. A maintenance camp operator at Chandalar Shelf, the elevated plateau between Coldfoot and Adigun Pass, one of the most consistently windswept segments of the highway, may tell you that the ground blizzard is already running and visibility is below a quarter mile. Those two pieces of information lead to different departure decisions. Wind is the weather element that drivers who are new to the Dalton consistently underestimate. The Brooks Range creates localized wind acceleration effects at Adigun Pass, the only road crossing of the Brooks Range in Alaska, that can produce sustained winds and gusts significantly exceeding what the forecast shows for the broader corridor. High-profile vehicles like 18-wheelers are particularly vulnerable to cross-wind effects on exposed ridgelines, and the pass crosses exposed ridgelines. There are documented cases of trucks being blown off the road at Adigun, and experienced drivers approach pass crossings in marginal wind conditions with a specific set of preparations, slowing down well before the exposed sections, monitoring the behavior of their trailer for early signs of aerodynamic instability, and being prepared to stop and wait if conditions at the summit are beyond safe operating parameters. All of this begins as a decision made in Fairbanks, based on what the weather picture looks like before departure. The pre-trip weather analysis also includes an assessment of the day's daylight window. For much of the Dalton winter season, the operating environment is either full polar darkness, north of Coldfoot, Drivers experience weeks of continuous night during the deep winter, or extremely limited twilight that barely lifts the darkness for a few hours per day. This affects almost everything about how the run is planned. Visibility planning, lighting system checks, the timing of the Adigun Pass crossing relative to the minimal available light. All of this is calculated before departure. Experienced haul road drivers don't simply check that their headlights work. They check that every lighting system on the truck and trailer is fully functional, because a lighting failure north of the Brooks Range in polar darkness, on a road shared with other 80,000-pound vehicles running without lane markings, carries consequences that don't exist on any other commercial route in North America. The final component of the Fairbanks preparation that deserves attention is the physical state of the driver. This is the most difficult to document and quantify, but experienced haul road veterans are consistent in describing it as a real factor in how they think about departure. A Dalton winter run is not a run that can be completed on inadequate sleep with the plan to catch up later. The cognitive demands of managing an 80,000-pound vehicle on a gravel road in darkness, in temperatures that can damage unprotected human tissue in minutes, through mountain passes and river crossings and sections of glare ice, require sustained alertness over the full duration of the trip. Alaska's FMCSA Hours of Service exemption allows commercial drivers operating within the state a 15-hour driving window within a 20-hour duty window, more flexibility than the lower 48's 11-hour driving limit within a 14-hour duty window. That flexibility exists because of the operational realities of Alaska's road network, but it is not an invitation to push beyond human limits. Experienced drivers treat sleep before a Dalton departure as seriously as they treat any mechanical check. A truck with everything working perfectly, driven by a fatigued driver, is a less safe system than a truck with a minor mechanical inconvenience driven by someone fully rested. This is the knowledge that doesn't appear in any inspection checklist and isn't covered in any federal regulation. It is the accumulated professional understanding of what this road does to human beings over the duration of a full run. The Dalton doesn't tire you in the way a long, flat interstate tires you, with boredom and monotony. It tires you with constant alertness, constant micro-adjustments, constant weather scanning, constant surface assessment. By the time an experienced driver reaches dead horse, they have been making decisions essentially without pause for the entire run. That level of sustained cognitive load has a cost, and the cost compounds if the driver wasn't rested before it began. When the pre-trip is finally complete, when the brake systems have been checked with winter-specific attention, the fuel has been treated and loaded, the tires set to cold weather pressure, the cargo secured beyond standard specification, the APU verified, the communications equipment confirmed, the weather picture assessed, the daylight window calculated, and the driver has determined that they are rested and physically capable of making the run. The truck pulls out of the yard in Fairbanks and heads north on the Elliott Highway toward Livengood, where the Dalton begins. From that moment, the driver is in a world that is largely self-contained. The safety margin for the next 414 miles was determined in that yard. Every decision made during the preparation phase either expands or contracts the driver's ability to respond to what the road presents. The blizzard that comes out of nowhere at Gobbler's Knob, the glare ice on the descent from Adigun Pass, the ground drift at Chandalar's Shelf that reduces visibility to the length of a tractor, the moose that appears in the headlights at the Yukon River Bridge. All of those situations are more manageable for a driver who left Fairbanks with everything checked, everything treated, everything secured, and a full night of sleep behind them. They are more dangerous for a driver who cut corners in the yard because the run looked routine. What the Dalton teaches, over years of experience, is that no run is routine. The road gives that lesson to drivers who need it, and it gives it in conditions that have no tolerance for unpreparedness. The veterans on the haul road, the drivers who have made the run dozens or hundreds of times across multiple seasons, who know the road's personality at every mile marker, who can read a sky above the Brooks Range and feel a change in wind before the gusts arrive. Those drivers are not casual about the hour in the yard. They are the most careful people in the yard because they know exactly what they are driving into And they know that everything that happens on the road starts with what happened before it. The next time you see a commercial truck moving through difficult conditions, through the dark, through the weather, through terrain that most people would not choose to drive in even a car, understand that what you're seeing is the result of preparation that happened hours or days before. Preparation made in yards and parking lots, and maintenance bays by professionals who have spent years learning exactly what this work demands of both their equipment and themselves. And if extreme cold and darkness and the logistics of surviving the Arctic represent one dimension of what professional drivers face on the Dalton Highway, consider what it means when the threat is not cold but fire, when the smoke comes from the trees instead of the exhaust, and the road ahead is lit not by headlights but by flame. Because wildfire season on the trucking corridors of North America creates a completely different set of challenges and an entirely different kind of preparation story. That one comes next.